Everybody here ready?
Here.
Evolunia?
Sure. Yeah.
Alright. So this is a little section, it's not too long, it's a few pages, by Winfield. I forget from which book it is. It might be Freedom and Modernity. It's a book that at last I checked, there is no free version on the internet. So actually, Hyperion ended up manually writing it out and pasting it years ago, because both of us were surprised that he would have such a thing. It's such, the first time you encounter it, you're like, that just sounds so outrageous, like even from a non-Marxist perspective. Because like, even outside, like the Marxist perspective, the word class has negative connotations anyway, and so to have a defense of class society just sounds so bad. So it's, and he knew this. He was making a hot take on purpose. It's called The Injustice of Classless Society. So this is in the middle of a book, so he's kind of going off a little bit of something prior. Not much is lost, though. So he says, this is precisely the case with the Marxist call for a classless society to remedy the inequalities of the market economy. As Hegel's argument makes manifest, Marx and his followers have misconceived class relations, conflating them with particular historical forms, whose own character has been misunderstood in virtue of the mistaken notion of exploitation and the labor theory of value. Far from entailing domination and subjugation, belonging to a class is an act of civil freedom tied through bonds of reciprocal recognition to the same exercise on the part of others. In contrast to caste, tribe, estate, or other groupings where membership is determined by factors given independently of the wills of their members, the classes generic to the market can only be joined by voluntarily undertaking to satisfy personally chosen needs for commodities in reciprocity with others. So, I mean, this kind of goes with the regular liberal notion. Like, well, what is wrong with classes? Well, in the usual sense, what is wrong with classes is like, oh, if you're born in, like, well, what was wrong with it was that you were born into these classes. And there was no way to get in or out. You know, if you're born in the high class, one, you wouldn't want to get out of the high class. But even if you did, there were actually many things tying you down. You couldn't just get up and leave because you wanted to. There were things. If you were in the lower classes, you're a serf or other things, or if you were part of the slave class, obviously you had no choice in being there or getting out of there. You had very little choice of mobility, all kinds of other things.
This doesn't seem like that much of a hot take because, correct me if wrong here, but it seems to follow that if Winfield supports the market, which I think he does, as the site where everybody's will is negotiated, then it kind of follows that class is a valid way of categorizing the types of wills or something. I don't know. Let's see what argument he makes.
It's a bit different. It's about how, like, it's an individuating thing. It's about you choosing the way in which you're going to meet your needs in the market. And honestly, the first time I read this, it was a hot take, and I was still like fresh off my Marxist days. But he made a good argument. I buy it. So although the constitutive autonomy of market agents gives all the formal opportunity to exercise any mode of earning, the options of particular agents may well be restricted by market factors, including the relative commodity ownerships and needs of different parties to exchange and the economic decisions that are made on that basis. Nevertheless, no matter how few opportunities a market participant may have, whatever mode of earning he ends up practicing is still undertaken through an act of choice predicated upon a like decision by other commodity owners. Because individuals can perform their class roles only in interdependence, mediated by commodity exchange, the mutual acknowledgement of others' market autonomy cannot be merely a disguise for a unilateral domination. The very structure of commodity relations gives its participants little choice but to recognize and respect the market autonomy of the members of other classes with whom they must freely interact in order to engage in those modes of earning, making them class members in their own right. So, one, you're not forced into being in a class by any external factor. Two, in being recognized as being in a class, nobody outside of that class or within that class can really force you to be that. And to recognize you is to give you an affordance of certain rights. This is why I don't like the term wage slave, because it's not true. Like when you compare it to slavery as such, the worker, or the Marxist jargon, proletarian, can quit. If you're a slave, you can't quit. You can't say, you know what, I don't like this job, I'm gonna go find a better job. Now, even if there are no other jobs to be had, you can quit. Now, the reality is that historically, there are clearly places in which states will not give a shit about protecting your rights. But those states not giving a shit doesn't mean that the actual fundamental relationship is somehow invalid. It just means that that state is a shitty state. If the capitalist can literally trap you within, company-owned stores, company-owned and run stores with company money, company-owned and run houses with company money. We literally have had cases of actual basic slavery here in the U.S. up to today. I think a few years ago there was someplace in California where they were literally keeping these migrant workers locked up in cages overnight so that they couldn't leave. And the man who was running the whole operation was like, oh, well, it's for their safety. Yeah, uh-huh. So if they were actually respecting the autonomy of their class role, they wouldn't do these things. Whether they do or do not actually accept those, whether there's a state that actually will stand in and protect your rights, is a different issue. So extra market forces may well distort the independent relations between classes, as can occur with another structure of justice. Nevertheless, taken by itself, as it issues from commodity relations, the class division represents a realization of economic freedom, just as class membership represents not a burden but a right to which all members of the market are entitled. Since, as we have seen, class divisions do not disrupt the exercise of market autonomy, but are rather necessary instruments of economic freedom, classes have a legitimate role in the just economy. It may well be true that commodity relations cannot secure equal economic opportunity for all without being supplemented by other institutions, whose own legitimacy will depend on their being structures of freedom. If, however, the class division is a necessary outcome of satisfying self-chosen needs and reciprocity with others, the just society must be a class society. What condemns the Marxist endeavor to establish a society without class divisions is not that it is hopelessly unrealizable, but rather that it automatically violates the structures of social justice. A classless society cannot be established without depriving everyone of their personal economic freedom to choose their own needs and to decide independently what activity they will engage in to satisfy them in conjunction with others. Both these freedoms would have to give way simply because it is the exercise of this market autonomy that creates and sustains class divisions. This very fact makes the foundation of a classless society an entirely clear and practicable enterprise. All it requires is eliminating the market in favor of a universal compulsory administration of benefits and occupations, where the differentia of class, the needs and modes of earning of individuals, are all strictly limited to one and the same type. So this is the whole idea that the community is the sole and single employer and commander of labor power. So, there are no private capitalists, there are no private owners. Everything is run as a political command economy, where the community collectively, in whatever methodology they choose, comes together, gets decisions done for what will be produced, how will be produced, who will produce it, how much will be allotted for that production, how much will be allotted for the consumption, and whatnot. And Winfield's basically saying, like, this whole thing about, like, being able to choose what you want. He says, choose their own needs. Needs and wants don't have a distinction in commodities. They're the same thing. There is no such thing like here's a need and here's a want. All wants are needs, all needs are wants. There's really no priority. And to decide independently what activity will engage, satisfying them in conjunction with others. So, if you don't want to be a worker for someone else, suppose that you are a highly entrepreneurial spirit. Well, under a communist producing community, you don't have that choice. You can't say, well, I'm going to be an entrepreneur of, I don't know, video games or whatever. You don't get to decide that. The only thing you get to do is, well, I'd like to do this. I got to go to the community, have a vote, have discussions, get them to approve what I'm doing. And it's through their acceptance of what I want and how I want to do it that things will get done. They don't get done by me seeking something for myself, finding other people who I can agree with, so long as, rights are not being violated, and just doing it. So one of the things that comes about of that is, the division of being somebody who's not a proletarian, being what Marx called a petty bourgeois, a small skills tradesman or whatever, entrepreneur. You definitely can't be a capitalist because you're not allowed to employ other people, even if you would perhaps sometimes offer a better employment opportunity than the state would offer people. And you certainly can't engage in rent and whatnot. The fuck?
I have a few critical remarks, but I'm saving it to the end.
Yeah, hold on, sorry. Oh, that's why. For some reason, my ringtone was all the way to the bottom. So, although various options are possible, a most familiar one is to prohibit individuals from seeking capital or rentable property as objects of need and to restrict their wants to consumer goods, while requiring that they undertake wage labor as their sole form of earning. These measures would indeed establish a class of society whose members would be subject to a universal proletarization, in whose collective administration they might take greater or lesser part. All could well enjoy perfect economic equality and security and perhaps an equal say in managing the social enterprise. However, what would be totally suppressed would be each individual's freedom of interest, whose impeded realization comprises the economic wrong that the elimination of classes is supposed to rectify. The inability to earn a convenient livelihood through self-chosen activity is the socially specific injustice at stake in the economic disadvantage rooted in inequalities of wealth. In eliminating all exercise of market freedom, the classless society generalizes the very wrong it should remedy. In place of the failings of an unregulated market, it imposes a secure management of associated producers. It imposes a secure equality of servitude that cannot be mitigated by any participation in a collective management of associated producers. No matter how much influence individuals may wield in determining the common benefits and occupations to which all are subject, this does not give them back the freedom to choose independently their own wants or the activities they will personally undertake to satisfy those needs in reciprocity with others. This is why the exclusive rule of collective interest requires the annulment of the market. A classless society cannot survive if room is given to freedom of interest, for once individuals exercise this right, the door is open for the formation of class divisions. Closing that door is all too real a possibility. The classless society cannot be dismissed as a fictitious utopia, beckoning from beyond history's end because neither human nature nor human convention can support it. On the contrary, it is a very real social alternative whose implementation is both technically feasible and potentially durable. Just to support the notion of class society has attracted in our time should be evidence enough of how great a danger it poses. to the just economy's institution of freedom. And that's the end of it. Go ahead and give your remarks, Abalonia.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I kind of have difficulty with is that it appeared Winfield's. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Winfield, and he does a lot of good work. But it's in all fairness, this is a problem in Marxist scholarship as well, of how to define the notion of what a class is. And the thing which, at least how I understood how class society has been formed, is, when there is a division between necessary labor and surplus labor, and that there's the stratification of classes, so to speak, at least in that sense, is when you actually have some superordinate or higher class that is commanding or appropriating the surplus labor that is produced, whether by extra economic or by economic means. So like raising, say, productive powers in like a slave economy, that there's one sense in which that can be done but is limited, but there is a real growth in productive powers under capital. But at least, to kind of go back to the kind of issue that I have, is that I think for people to be, individually realized, so to speak, as an economic participant who is recognized in reciprocal relation with others, that kind of presumes that one is a producer and also at the same time a consumer, and that there isn't some sort of division, so to speak, where one-sidedly things are being produced just for the sake of value augmentation. Like, it has to be realized on both ends of both from the standpoint of the seller and also the buyer. That kind of be my first thing I'd like to advance. But
yeah. As far as I know, he's taking the definition of class as the structural relationship to the means of production. So,
okay.
So it's that form. So that it's not about like who's exploiting who. It's about like what is your relationship to the means of production. Are you working for somebody else? Are you selling your labor power? You're a proletarian. Are you expanding value through a productive activity, or producing commodities of some sort, physical or some other form? Then you're a capitalist. Are you taking some kind of commodity which you don't directly sell but you rent out its use? Well, then you're a rentier. Are you exchanging money directly, by lending? Then you are that. Those are the classes.
Mm-hmm.
And so this whole issue is, well, not everybody wants to be a worker, which is true. it's very rare. Most people are perfectly fine being a proletarian, because it is a very different mindset and lifestyle to, and the kind of like pressures you deal with are very different when you're in these different relationships. But some people prefer those things. So I agree with him in saying that like it does seem unjust to me that to have a society in which the only option is, well, you're a pro, because everybody's a pro. Uh, and the community as a whole is the capitalist, and it's a more controlled thing. It's not. It doesn't have to be like markets, but you don't have this way for other people who just don't want to fall into that to just kind of go on their own way. And so long as they're not harming anybody, uh, making their life like that.
Yeah, that's
Barring.
it's. Oh yeah, yeah, I do agree with that part of the critique, in that the kind of the thought that kind of developed, uh, it was it, I think it's consistent with the kind of the orthodox kind of Marxist thinking, that there's an element of positivism there. But I think it was more well articulated by Lenin when he talks about the state essentially being a one big monolithic factory, and and the kind of relationship that individuals have to the state, you have to think for a moment and say, hang on a minute. If if the industrialists and the capitalists, if we're supposed to be fighting them, then why the hell is everyone suddenly like a wage worker for the state? And then, you know, with the nationalization of land, and there is a whole thing with land nationalization, um, kind of like because land is not really something that uh, it's kind of alien to capital. It's not really something that it can really
Yeah, you can't
uh,
produce land.
yes, yes. Um, so in some cases, it might be advantageous for even the most liberalized economies to nationalize land in some cases. Um, but there the whole there's a conception, I think, of property ownership that kind of falls into a sort of, um, at least in my view, a kind of unproductive dichotomy between, you know, strictly private and strictly, or well, public, in the sense of like the state owns it. Um, like something that at least I would like to see, and something that uh, I was kind of like am a proponent of, is things like cooperative or joint ownership of, but to actually have it on the basis of, shared interests or shared, um, between people who are uh, working, or between people who are farming the land, or something like this. Um, and there's of course I think I speak somewhat more optimistically, a real sort of conception that can be articulated there, but um, at least in the the critical sense of, um, the critical sense of attacking the program of just nationalizing and collectivizing that's not something that you can uh, instantly sort of bring about the desired sort of change that you want to see. Um, and that's also kind of one of the problems that I have with other Marxists annoyingly refusing to describe or even think about like anything normative. Like it has to be strictly historical, which is really annoying and backwards because the concept of the thing is the thing that actually produces the history. It's not, you know, suddenly like something happens in history and it's like, oh, there it is, I reflect on it.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah, like this is a basically like a very contained thought of his. I know, I've heard it from a couple of his lectures. Stuff that's kind of like links to this. Uh, it's what I don't like though. Like I do think that there is something valuable in just like being able to have these different relationships to production, so that people have that freedom. The thing that he says about like being able to choose one's needs, that just has to do with the whole idea of like plant production in general. Uh,
Mhm.
One, planning is a reality. Corporations do it like heavily. They do it more than the Soviets ever could dream of
Mm.
nowadays.
Yeah.
Uh, but that's a different sort of planning than what Marxists have in mind. Marxists have an idea of a politically planned thing, like where we have to come together, at some points of time, collectively decide, here are the exact allotments for the things that we want to do. Only these things will get done. This is the only, we're allotting only labor for this. There is no open labor for whatever else people might manage to scratch up and do, or, might take off and nobody knows it is. Uh, this freedom of like opening new markets, the freedom of just like, well, frivolous stuff. Like, I don't think it makes sense to have planned frivolity. That's conceptually incoherent. That's like having like planned fads. You really can't plan fads and fashion. They just kind of come and go. Uh, and
Mhm.
that's one of the things that the markets do. Like part of the reason that they are not efficient uh, is precisely because they can't. They're for things that can't be planned in the first place. So they come, they go, they keep going, and then suddenly they fall off. And then sometimes like people think it's gonna take off, and it never takes off. So it's kind of this give and take guesswork. Uh, but it's about shit that doesn't fundamentally matter. Like, do I care that there's a shortage of PS5s at any point? Well, there was years ago. No, I don't. I really don't. Uh, is it fine that these corporations was kind of rushing it to try to meet the demand? Yeah, it's perfectly fine. I don't care. I don't particularly care that people were like scalping PS5s, to sell them at like 4 times the price that they bought it. People want to be stupid with their money. Fine, let them be stupid with their money. I mean, it's their own frivolous want. I have no problem with that. And I don't think you can plan those things. It doesn't make any sense to me that they should. Stuff like housing, sure, I can definitely see how, to a large degree, housing should it be planned. Not entirely, but a lot of it should be planned. Uh,
Mhm.
just to, have like rational cities, for example.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that there is kind of an interesting um, uh, part of this that goes into at least part of uh, the scholarship around the Uno Sakin sort of school. Actually, something that he was developing was this kind of distinction between uh, quantitative and qualitative use values. Um, that essentially kind of the notion that um, something being used because it is useful for some other production process versus a more immediate good that is, like more specific to circulation, simply because the demand for it exists. It's something that is needed by, and it can't really be, well, in the first sense, it can't really be a priori determined like in advance whether something will be a quantitative or qualitative use value. But there is, I think, a sense in which, if something is so labor intensive or very costly to produce, then that sort of, hard exertion, if it's something that can be like produced in a factory or manufactured, like assembly lines and stuff, um, that I think is definitely uh, something that's more of a quantitative or producer. But if it's between something that's like something that's more like either individually produced or provided, um, in the sense that there isn't like a mediation between a person and a tool or machine, uh, which is more of the dimension in which uh, or why with qualitative use values it's more specific to local needs or community needs, um, which is something
Yeah.
that which is something you can't really like plan for in advance. Like, I mean, people can immediately sort of say like demand uh, like what they want, but it's something that is realized by way of certain conditions being present, and really purely because it is a free act or free choice by the person themselves as an expression of their freedom. But like with a lot of producer goods and resources, um, I think there is the interest or demand there for uh, at least in the sense if people actually like uh, agree that it would be advantageous to produce it in in a factory. In fact, it'd be pretty wasteful to it, just even in the sense of time, money, resources to not try to um, mass produce those kinds of um, intermediate goods.
Yeah, I think a lot of it uh, can be foreseen actually. Like stuff like the internet, uh, stuff that seems to have infrastructural tendencies. One could make like a pretty easy deductions. Yeah, this could become like something integral, even though like at the beginning it's just kind of vapid stuff, people playing around. Uh, Even stuff like say like Bitcoin, you can see at least like the tendency that the blockchain technology can be used for many other things other than monopoly money basically. Even though most of it ends up being it's basically legal gambling.
Right.
And it's those things where we can see, yeah, like why are like so many resources being allowed to be wasted on basically what's legal gambling? It is just a giant waste of things. It's just a giant pyramid scheme.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, there's a second little essay called "The Injustice of Human Rights." This one's a bit longer. So let's see. At a time when foreign policies draw increasing criticism for advancing national interests without regard for human rights, the sanctity of the appeal to human rights has itself gone unchallenged. Reinforced by constitutional preambles, United Nations declarations, Helsinki Accords, and presidential pledges, the consensus has reached such proportions that when advocates of human rights are caught supporting social and political injustice, they are attacked for hypocrisy, as if the principle they fail to apply were a self-evident truth. What has been ignored is that human rights are themselves a contradiction in terms. Their contradiction, however, is of much more than theoretical significance, for when human rights are elevated to the level of a principle of public affairs, they both exclude all specifically social and political critique and debase political freedom by reducing it to nothing more than an exercise in civil rights. These practical consequences emerge from the basic dilemma entailed in conceiving human rights in the first place. This dilemma touches the very heart of the natural right conception, which provides the foundation for the liberal tradition. Although liberal theory has virtually come to prescribe what passes for legitimate political discourse in America by being the unquestioned dogma of political education in public schools, as well as the common credo of the two parties, the mass media, and all who have achieved recognition as responsible participants in political affairs, it founders upon a simple fallacy directly embodied in the notion of human rights. This is the basic confusion of what is determined through freedom with what is given by nature. Natural right theory falls into this confusion by first granting that rights involve what individuals can freely will without being legitimately constrained by others, while secondly deriving rights from nature, considered generally as the natural order whose law is given independently of men and women's will, and more specifically as the given nature of the individual human subject. The problem besetting natural right theory is that the very content of rights prohibits them from being either natural givens or products of any natural condition, or from being attributes of the self, given prior to and independently of individuals' relations to one another. Although natural right theory turns to the natural, unwilled factors in answer to the inability of existing convention to prescribe what ought to be, the most basic examination of rights reveals that their normativity can be established no more on natural than on conventional givens. So, I mean, that's pretty standard. Most people appeal to human rights as you're a biological human being, therefore you have rights. That's an appeal to nature. But, you know, what nature they could be appealing to, it's often not clear. I mean, if you're appealing to social nature, to the nature of the will, then, you know, Winfield would agree. But if you're appealing just to the biological fact that one is human, that's not a good foundation. The problem besetting natural right theory is that the very content of rights prohibits them from being either natural givens or products of any natural condition. Oh, sorry, I already read that. First of all, to the degree that rights consist in the modes of autonomous action by an individual which others are legitimately obligated to respect, rights contain a normative dimension tied to conscious willing. Consequently, rights cannot be reduced to relations of nature, for whether the latter proceed through causal necessity or a probabilistic quantum mechanics, the absence of willing within the natural events signifies the exclusion of self-determination and all normative questions of what ought to be. Since rights, therefore, refer not to what happens according to nature, but to what voluntary actions individuals may legitimately undertake, no anthropological fact of human species being can prescribe what men and women have a right to do. The human condition may mandate what individuals are anthropologically capable of doing, but not which of their humanly possible actions should be performed. Nevertheless, as natural right theory itself recognizes, the normative dimension of rights precludes their reduction to merely operative rules of behavior. Since rights draw a distinction between just and unjust action, they effectively involve recognition of a principle specifying what ought to be done regardless of what happens to be given practice. Might cannot make right, for the achievement of compliance with given rules only signifies what behavior is rule governed and not that it involves an exercise of freedom which ought to be respected. Thus, although rights are not natural in the sense of being given independently of willing, they are not just products of convention relative to any order to which a community conforms. Rights do indeed come into being only by convention, arising within history instead of in a state of nature. But in doing so, they can neither be bound to nor justified by the particular conditions of their inaction. Rather, they are rights in not ordered behavior only by being unconditioned and universal, for otherwise they would be stamped with a relative character undermining their required normativity and rendering them no more justifiable than any other mode of conduct. The great task of the theory of rights thus consists in conceiving what are those relations among individuals which have unconditioned universality, even though they must be willed into being by individuals who, being unbeholden to natural necessity, can just as easily will something else. For this theoretical endeavor, neither a natural or a purely positive conception will do, since determination of rights can derive no more from given practice than from given nature. Right, so rights aren't natural, they're social. But in saying, well, they're social, the social constructivists would say, well, anything that we decide is right is right. If we decide that, you have a right to have slaves, then, it's right to have slaves. He's saying, no, that's not the case. It has to do with a fundamental structure of willing, which is tied to recognition. So one would say that it's not specific formations of sociality that establish a right as a right on a purely conceptual level, so much as the necessities of sociality as such, as a rational reality, set what a right is. So, you may have a society empirically that, makes it legal to have slaves. But if you ask, well, what is it that the human being is as a recognitive being and a thinking being, a consequence of that is that you cannot possibly have slaves. Like, slavery is just like incoherent. You can't have a being that you recognize has a will, which is free, which you're going to treat as an object and think that that's being coherent with your own nature, in that you recognize that they are recognizing beings, but you're still going to treat them as an object. That doesn't make any sense. So if this means that rights cannot be founded in nature or existing convention, it must also be recognized that they are not derivable from any structure of the single self, because rights consist in exercise of freedom whose legitimacy is respected by the will of others. Rights cannot be understood simply with reference to one individual's manner of willing. Although a choosing will may be ascribed to an individual, irrespective of that individual's relation to others, an individual's right to act in a certain way further involves the duty of others to respect that mode of action. Consequently, rights exist not as a function of the self, but only in virtue of specific voluntary relations among a plurality of individuals. The conjunction of right and duty comprising rights consists in these interrelations, which must always have the form of mutual recognition and respect, since only one has obligations when one's own exercise of freedom is acknowledged. Therefore, to refer to rights is to refer to those modes of interaction which have normative validity. If you read the introduction to the philosophy of right, it starts out with a whole section deriving the free will. And actually, Winfield has a set of lectures online on the Internet Archive on the philosophy of right, and he comments on this too, about how peculiar this is. That, he decided to stick in a part which is basically the end of subjective spirit, right at like the break between the theoretical cognition, practical cognition, because the will has to do with practical cognition. Well, not it has to, it is practical cognition. But once you read it and then you read the transition to the proper beginning of right itself, what Hegel defines as the quote-unquote free will, or the fully actualized will, that is the fundamental structure of right. And one may be mistaken in thinking that this happens in a singular individual, because it seems that the singular individual can will their own will abstractly by reasoning about reasoning itself, so that your own reasoning power. you know the distinction of the lack in the world towards this end of having a proper cognition, and you go ahead and engage the activity to bridge that gap and connect it to actualize the concept of free thinking, which is education. But then it's understood that in the relationship of will to will, the will willing itself as will, it's not a mere representation of my will to myself. It is the engagement of a living will to another living will. Because if I don't engage another living will, I really don't understand fully, consequentially, what free will really is. If I don't have somebody else that can tell me no and give me reasons to which I am accountable to and responsive to, I will never fully know exactly what the free will actually is. So this relationship of will to will as living wills is the relationship of right. So what determines the specific relations of these interactions is not nature or convention, but the demand of normativity itself. Normative validity requires unconditioned universality, as much in matters of justice as in matters of truth. For an interaction to be a relation of right and not just a given practice, it must be something that ought to hold irrespective of whatever particular conditions there may be, which are not themselves relations of right worthy of the same respect. If an interaction were relative to any particular prior conditions that were not themselves rightful, the interaction would be determined by what stands outside right and accordingly forfeit its status as something that ought to be. So you can't have any particular right grounded in anything else or conditioned by anything else that isn't a right. You can't say that you have a right to family on some natural condition, and when that natural condition doesn't hold, well then you just don't have that right. That doesn't work. Probably the easiest one is a family. Like, you have a right to a family insofar as you can afford a family, right? And then, if you just can't afford to have enough money to have food for a child, then you don't have a right to have a child or, a spouse or whatever. That doesn't make any sense. In this sense, relations of right are universally valid. Being justified in any situation's particularity is not already a specific relation of right. As such, their universality is no less unconditioned, for what alone can legitimately limit a relation of right is another rightful relation. Something interesting, what is it? There's that famous thing, I think it's from either the philosophy of history or it's somewhere in the phenomenology spirit. I think it's probably the philosophy of history where he comments about tragedy. He says, tragedy is, not between a wrong and right, but between two rights. But it's not because rights themselves conflict as such. As a matter of fact, Hegel says that properly understood, there is a perfectly clear hierarchy of rights. No right is in a horizontal relationship where you might be able to swap one right for another because conditions force you to or you choose to. There's a direct connection where they may condition each other vertically, but they don't condition each other horizontally. So there's no instance where one can speak of that the valid realization of any right should harm any other right. Consequently, the content of right cannot be determined by any independently. Consequently, the content of right cannot be determined by any independently given factors. Instead of being caused or founded by something else, rights must be their own ground and thus exist for their own sake and no other. For this to be the case, they must have their specific character in virtue of their own relationship and not for any separate end, procedure, or consequence. In other words, the interactions of right must be self-determined and owe their entire content to the very mode of freedom they realize. As rights testify by their characteristic content at some respected prerogative to act, as some respect their prerogative to act, only freedom can provide normative validity, for self-determination is precisely what has unconditioned universality by being determined by nothing other than itself. Therefore, the interactions of right can have no necessary relation to the given particularities of species being or any other prior ground. Rights rather have their legitimacy by being self-determined structures of interaction. For that very reason, they do not have foundations. The problem with natural right theory is that it attempts to give foundations to rights. Whether this be done by grounding them in natural laws or the nature of the self, as in traditional liberal theory, or by determining them with a privileged procedure of construction, as in Rawlsian models, the same foundational fallacy is committed. So long as rights are determined by something other than themselves, they are left relative to a content which is outside right and therefore illegitimate. Any attempt to escape this dilemma by making convention the source of all right, for example, as practical holism undertakes, only re-engages the foundational fallacy by substituting convention for the other grounds it seeks to avoid. In this respect, the different modes of foundationalism in the theory of right parallel the various metaphysical approaches in the theory of truth. Just as what is right cannot be founded upon what is not already normatively valid, so the justification of truth claims cannot be based on what is not already justified as true. For this reason, philosophy can no more proceed from immediate references to reality or transcendental conditions than right can be based on facts of nature or procedures of construction. The attempts of Wittgenstein, Gadamer, and Rorty to supplant epistemological foundationalism by grounding philosophy in the given convention of discourse is as much an assertion of a new foundation as is the ethical nihilism of conventionalism in rights. Just as rights must be self-determined, so philosophical discourse must be self-grounding, and this it can only be if it proceeds from no given foundations whatsoever. If all these considerations indicate how the question of rights is bound up with the determination of freedom, it should also be evident that freedom has reality only in the interactions of right. Where the mutually concording willing of rights is lacking, the reality of freedom is undermined by being subject to the contingent circumstances of whether or not individuals choose to act in ways which violate each other's autonomy. With interactions of right, on the other hand, individuals have the reality of their freedom unconditionally respected because rights consist in just that conjunction of rights and duties where the self-determinations of individuals reinforce one another. In other words, right unconditionally universal, without which individuals have only the subjective liberty of the self to choose arbitrary particular acts subject to the arbitrariness of others. Accordingly, when it comes to determining who has rights, what alone warrants consideration is whether the candidates in question have minds and wills with which to recognize and be recognized by others. This is where natural differences can come into play, but only in the subsidiary role of providing preconditions rather than determining principles for the needed minds and wills. So, I mean, he was cheeky about that, but saying, well, if by human rights you're talking about some kind of natural foundation, like a biological one, yeah, it's not going to work. Since rights have to do with thinking and willing is a form of thinking. We'd have to say that obviously if aliens who were as intelligent or more intelligent than us came around, they would have rights. But it can be kind of weird to call it human rights unless by human you just meant a thinking being. In which case, fine, I suppose. Let's see, it says, in other words, right, unconditionally universal, that is subjective freedom, without which individuals have only subjective liberty of self. People might say, well, rights aren't real, because obviously, what if I decide to not obey your rights or not respect your rights, and I don't care about my own rights? Well, that just makes you stupid. There are consequences. Hegel's own account of rights is that right exists as a realization of freedom. The reason we have rights is not some random useful, quote-unquote, useful fiction that we created to have a functional society, but rather it's an outgrowth, an overflowing of what it is that our rational nature produces and requires of us, such that when we engage in it, we are satisfied in the activity of recognition of rights and the reality. And not only that also opens up a whole panoply of spheres of freedom where you can do things that are not doable in a state of nature where you don't have rights, and it's just rule of the stronger. Might is right. Anyways, I don't think there's that much to say about that. That was more of an explanatory little thing I had forgotten. But I still do find it funny that it's against human rights, knowing full well that it's a hot take.